We begin unit number 2 and lecture 3. The topic here is Islamic theology and philosophy, the context. When we say context, we mean the history of how things really got going. Of course, that means we look at Muhammad and what was going on in his day. We are thinking about Muhammad and his family and his immediate successors. It is remembered that Muslims put a lot of emphasis on this word Jahiliyyah in reference to pre-Islamic days. They emphasize that it was a time of ignorance, a time of darkness. So when Islam came in, it brought the light and things changed. Now there's some truth in that. There were things that did change for the better. However, I think that Muslims put too much emphasis on that and exaggerate. In any event, Muhammad was 570 to 632. We're not exactly sure if it was exactly 570, but thereabouts. He was born. Muhammad was born in 570, and in 595, he was married to Khadija, who was a businesswoman, a successful businesswoman apparently, and she was wealthy. And Muhammad was working for her. He was called Al-Amin, the faithful one, so he had a good reputation. And she saw some great qualities in him, proposed to him, and they got married, and they had some children. No sons. The sons didn't live, but he had 4 daughters, and those daughters, one of whom was Fatima, a very important person in the history of Islam. Muhammad stayed faithful to her while she was alive. He only had one wife, and then later, after she passed away, he did marry other women. Many times he married widows of soldiers whose lives were lost in battle, and so most of his marriages were quite noble, but some of them are questionable because Muhammad, was just human. He did whatever he wanted to do, and as he became more powerful, he took more liberties. In 610, his revelations began in the cave of Hira. For some reason, he was meditating and he seemed unhappy. And so he started having these revelations, and then he wasn't sure what was going on. He wasn't sure who this person was. Later he decides that it's Gabriel. But he did have some questions, and he had some strange symptoms. Of course, you're not the only one. Just thinking of John the Baptist, who was living in the wilderness and eating wild honey and other things, and just wearing a leather girdle or whatever he was wearing. He was pretty strange as well. But Muhammad did have some things going on that were rather unusual. But we know that when his revelations stopped for a time, he became very troubled. He went to his wife Khadija, and he told her about it, and she said, well, look, I'll check with Waraka bin Nawfal, because he's a Christian, and he's my cousin, and he knows the Hebrew Scriptures. And so when she did that, Waraka bin Nawfal said, yes, this is of God, so carry on with it. And so that was encouragement to Muhammad, and Muhammad stuck with it. And he had revelations for the next 22, 23 years. In 622, there was the Hijrah meaning the migration to Medina. Ummah was founded. In Medina, Muhammad's role changed a great deal. In Mecca, he'd been a persecuted prophet, but in Medina, he became the ruler, and his role changed. His power increased, and as his power increased, he became somewhat heavy-handed. And he took liberties. Oftentimes he would say that a revelation came, and so he had liberty to take this wife or that wife, or to do this or that. In 630, Muhammad took over Mecca and rededicated the Kaaba as the Islamic place of worship. He didn't really shed much blood at all, remembering that he had some very, very strong enemies there. But they became Muslim. And then in 632, Muhammad dies in the arms of in the lap of his favorite wife. So that's what happened to Muhammad. But when he died, there hadn't been much thought as to who should take over. Wasn't any thought, I don't think, about the Quran and what should happen there. That develops later too. His family, meaning primarily relatives or in-laws or whatever they are, take over. The first one is Abu Bakr, his father-in-law, but first we should remember that these four are called the rightly guided caliphs. That means that those who came after were not so rightly guided. Abu Bakr was the first one, as I mentioned, his father-in-law. He was the one who really saved the day when Muhammad died, because people went to pieces. Even Umar, the great warrior, didn't really think clearly when Muhammad passed away. And they said, oh, this can't happen, he can't die. But Abu Bakr, who had been a cloth merchant, who had become a Muslim, and was the father-in-law of Muhammad, he stood up in the mosque, and he held things together. He said, oh, believers, I want you to know that as for Muhammad, he's dead, but God does not die. So the Muslim community stayed together. Then there was Umar. Umar was the one who really spread Islam, often forcefully. 634 to 644, 10 years, and he's been called the Apostle Paul of Islam, in that he spread Islam far and wide. Then there was Uthman, the third caliph, 644 to 656. During Uthman's time, the Quran was collected and collated because of certain questions that came up as to the preservation of the Quran, and so that happened during the days of Uthman, but wasn't without conflict. And then last of all was Ali, from 656 to 661. Very sad, some people are, that Ali wasn't the first one, because they said, Ali was he was the relative. He was the one who had Muhammad's blood in his veins. And so why wasn't he chosen? In fact, he was chosen, but he was kept out of it. He was shut out of it. And when he did come to power in 656, his reign was very, very short indeed. The first caliphate was in Medina under Ali, and in Kufa, this was taken over by Muawiyah, who was the founder of the Umayyad dynasty, and who cruelly, brutally murdered Ali's son, Hussein. And throughout history, the Muslims have been grieving over that brutal murder, that injustice, that terrible thing that's happened in the history of Islam. But there is an underlying question here that has never been solved in Islam, and that is, who is the real ruler? Who is the ruler of the community? It's never been solved. Is it the one that's the most capable and worthy, like the Sunnis say? Or is it the one who is the best person, who's connected to Muhammad's family, who has a spiritual connection? Is it that person? And you can go to YouTube if you wanted to. If you wanted to look at the way that Muslims grieve over what was done in history, the Shiites beat themselves in a tahziyah, grieving and mourning, lamenting, beating themselves because of this terrible injustice. It's something that never seems to go away. So now we look at select dynasties and power centers. This is B. in your notes, and your texts that you're reading will be very clear as to what happened. We're just going over some things here quickly to mention in the lectures. The first major dynasty in the Islamic, of course, empire is the Umayyads from 680 to 750 A.D. Muawiyah, again, was the son of Abu Sufyan and his wife Hind. They were old enemies of Muhammad. If you ever get a chance to look at a video called The Message, it's about, I think, 2.5, 3 hours long. It gives the history here of the opposition that Muhammad faced. It portrays Abu Sufyan and his wife Hind as pretty terrible people. Hind was the one who was so mad at an uncle of Muhammad's that when he was killed in battle, she cut his liver open and ate it. They were old enemies, bitter enemies, and when Muhammad took over Mecca in 630, he didn't put them to death. They became Muslim. Of course, they didn't really have a choice. But it's quite amazing that Muhammad didn't take revenge on them, despite the fact that they had opposed him, fought against him, and people had been killed. That's the Umayyads from 682 to 750, the first major dynasty of the Islamic Empire. And it should be noted that this was a forceful takeover. Yazid, the son of Muawiyah, killed Hussein and the Shiites at Karbala in 680. This is a terrible thing that happened. We also want to keep in mind that the capital is Damascus. Damascus, now in Syria, was the capital of the empire established by Muawiyah. But it was much of the same old ways that the Arabs had practiced before Muhammad. There wasn't exactly any justice. They were notorious for tyranny and injustice and self-interest. But there were some encouraging things that happened. One is that the Umayyads took power in Spain as well. In Spain from 750 to 1031. This was Islam in the West. So there's rule in Spain. Now, from history, we know that Muslims were eventually booted out of Spain. It was quite a bit later. The exact date, or the date that's given, is 1492, when Muhammad sailed the ocean blue. But it's not quite true, because actually Muslims didn't actually leave weren't pushed out until the end of the 1600s, as were Jews, by the way. Anyway, the rule of the Muslims in Cordova, Spain, where there was a caliphate, things were quite different there than we just talked about before. In other words, in Spain there seemed to be progress. There was justice, and there was certainly there were arts and sciences were thriving. Another movie I might mention was one done by Akbar Ahmed, a Pakistani, a very learned fellow indeed. I think it's called Islam in the world, or something like that. It's several sections. It's about 6 or 7 hours long. In there, Akbar Ahmed too gives a lot of history of things that have happened, and talks about how Islam took root in various parts of the world, including Africa. And it's quite an interesting series that was done. Akbar Ahmed. But as I've mentioned, Islam in Spain was different. It was prosperous, and there was quite an emphasis on the arts and the sciences. Now, another thing that happened was that Islam took root in Africa, North Africa, and it was the Berbers from 750 to 1269. Interestingly, and somewhat as an aside, The Berbers are ones who are responding today to the gospel. So that's also very interesting. You had the Almoravids from 1056 to 1147 in the Berber movement there. Remember that the church there had been wiped out in reaction to the Crusades. You know, we do lament the fact as Christians that the church in North Africa was wiped out. But also let's keep in mind that there was a lot of animosity against the Christians because of the Crusades. And one of the ways that they showed their animosity was that they went into the church in North Africa and wiped it out. Unfortunately, it wasn't strong enough to stay strong. Another group was the Almohads from 1130 to 1269. This was a Spanish name of a Moorish dynasty. There was a renewed piety, and Islamic art thrived there as well. So this is some of the things that have happened in the history of Islam. And now we're going to go on fourth lecture onto the Abbasids.